Chapter 19, in which Constantin and Alaya also have a plan. One more. Radu was already striding uphill, getting deeper into the necropolis of great tombs on the crest of the hill. Frank looked up to where the sunset lay in bright tangerine and topaz bands across the sky, and down again to verdure that was taking on an evening bluish hue. He ran after. "We're pushing it already. We have to get back inside somewhere before the ones that are left come out." "We can still afford one more." The intricate wrought-iron gate of a large building was padlocked shut, its door sealed. Inside, Frank guessed at almost 10 rooms. This was a family mausoleum. It could house a dozen strigoi, more, all of them stirring awake right now, sniffing at the prey, waiting just outside. Being taken out of his cell, only to find out that all his new friends were still alive, had done something to him. Something wild and overriding enough to make him utterly forget his audience and reveal his nature to everyone. He could still feel it lying within him like an ember carefully packed in a firepot, waiting to become a fire. They had not died. Maybe it wasn't absolutely guaranteed that they would. If it wasn't absolutely guaranteed, maybe there were, after all, things he could do to save them. He grabbed Radu's elbow and pulled. "No, no more. You don't get a run from all of this by getting yourself killed. We'll burn any new dead, sweep again tomorrow, wear them down slowly. There's time." Radu's grey eyes looked silvery in the twilight, his face set. He might have modelled for a portrait of St. George had the artist not cared greatly about the character of his muses. "Those who die in the meantime are acceptable losses? Oh, you have no place playing the righteousness card with me." Frank tugged again, with an oddly twisted pleasure. So here he was on the other side of this moral horizon, choosing Radu's life over that of any number of unknown innocents, just as Radu had done for him at the start of all of this. It felt oddly right that he should make the same choice, be no more perfect than his lover. "We're going back." Radu tried pulling his arm out of the grip, hissed at the pain. The sound made Frank drop it, ashamed. He'd seen the bruises, deep indigo and brilliant red, so tight swollen the skin was glossy with it. If Radu's shoulders had not both been wrenched out of their sockets, it was not for lack of trying. "I'm sorry." Frank let his fingertips fall on Radu's wrist, soft as snow, in apology. But Radu had gone stiff, his focus somewhere behind Frank's left ear. "Father?" Everything in Frank froze to the marrow as Constantin's voice whispered behind him, took him back to loneliness and desperation in the forested dark. "Radu, what is this betrayal?" Stiffly, clumsily, Frank turned, put his shoulder to Radu's, faced down Constantin's glare. He didn't think his stomach was capable of being more unsettled, but when Alaya appeared out of a column of pearly mist and smiled at him like a plaster saint, it lurched so hard he had to clap a hand over his mouth to stop himself from being sick over her little feet. "Oh, darling," she said gently, "why are you being so nasty to us all of a sudden? Aren't we doing exactly what you asked?" In Valtia she had looked like a perfect boyarishna, scrubbed and pearly, flawless and clean, only the stench of dried blood to give away what she was. Constantin had been imposing, all in white like a saint, with a long beard so silvery fine it looked like a shaft of moonlight through a window. Now their clothes were caked in mud and gore, their skin tight as a drum over blood that seeped out through ear ducts and sweat glands, coating them with a fine red film. It made Frank think suddenly of Zaid's words. Radu had let them off the leash, given them a chance to prove themselves, and they had shown that what they really were was insatiable monsters. Radu was still trying not to see it. "Father, Mother," he said, the pleading tone always unnatural in his voice. "You take it too far. You could live here 1,000 years and not exhaust the riches of it, if you would just restrain yourselves a little. Alaya's lips folded back from her long front teeth. She made a hissing sound, like a kettle building up steam. Frank thought mental fingers brushed against something in his mind, but when he raised a hand to touch the pendant he had been given, into which he had stuffed his charm, they slipped away from him. He opened eyes he hadn't meant to close, found Constantine's gaze focused beneath his chin. You always said that fledglings were competition. You used to kill them yourself. Why did that change? It was not the only thing that had changed. Something had always troubled Frank about the way both of the Strigoi looked at Radu. They had watched him with an unsettling kind of possessive warmth that could have been mistaken for love, if, for example, you were a lonely boy growing up in a castle with the monsters who had eaten all your human kin for the past 500 years. Frank had always thought it was a pretence, put on and off as was convenient. At this moment it was off, and he didn't like what was left. You want to know? Constantine smiled, viciously amused. We don't have to tell him. Alaya pouted, but she gestured for Frank to fall in ahead of her as Constantine led them out of the cemetery, through dark streets scoured of beggars and bodies, where nothing moved but they. Lights behind closed shutters escaped in jolts and spots like furtive stars. Frank thought of the city as a body, with all the sweetness shut up inside, begging him, cajoling him to find a way to breach the barriers and drink. He put his hand to his necklace again, and tried to draw St. George's cloak around himself instead. Topkapi was as tight shut up as the city. They walked through the first court without meeting a petitioner. The long leaves of the palms rustled against the sky, and on the janissary tree the bodies of traitors dangled like ripe fruit, a faint wind creaking in the ropes that held them up. The fountains of the second court welled in silence, with the stars shattered on their surfaces. Radu and Frank's boots made a sharp smack against the stone paving as they walked, while the Strigoi moved through the silence like a scent. They turned into the private apartments, and here finally were guards at their posts. 2 black eunuchs, heavy with muscle, their faces as proud and stern as any lion's, bloodless holes where their throats used to be, and teeth like those of cobras. Father? They walked through pierced corridors of glittering stone, and Frank glimpsed through the latticework the figures of half-naked women standing to attention along the outer walls. Beautiful women, unveiled, clad in what looked like insubstantial scarves. Gold dripped from their arms and jewels flickered in their hair. They stood as still as soldiers, their eyes glazed with someone else's will. He had expected music, chatter, arguments, the clatter of trick-track tiles on the board, running feet and children shrieking, and laughter even, hopefully. But even the children stood by their mother's feet in solemn silence, packed away for later use. Eunuchs, living ones this time, stood in regular spacing along the outer side of the partition walls, their truncheons dangling from loose fingers, a look in their eyes, as Frank and Radu passed, as if they had seen something that troubled them, but they couldn't remember why. We shouldn't be here, Frank protested. We shouldn't have come in here. It's not allowed. I allow it. Constantine's smugness lifted the left side of his mouth, made his moustache crooked, and tapped a dried clot of blood and hair against his chin. He made a look-all-you-like gesture, as if the harem belonged to him alone. An admirable institution, don't you think? So much more efficient than keeping so many unruly boys. When we have smoothed out the transition to power, I believe this is the breeding system we will implement in future for all our stock. Father, Radu said again, full of a very old, patient despair. He had tried and tried and tried to get through to some essential core of decency in Constantine, tried to reawaken the father he remembered from his childhood, the one who had occasionally been kind, who had spoken of honour as though it meant something to him, who had given Radu presents on the appropriate occasions, and allowed his tutors to live. But he was beginning to wonder how far that had all been a performance, meant to tame him, to keep him compliant and dutiful and safe. He'd always known he was only useful until he had sired the next, more tractable generation. But he'd also always tried to tell himself there was something real in the love that had bound them as a family. There was something redeemable in them, something that made them parents and not just monsters wearing masks. Listen to yourself. Why don't you come home? This gluttony will not stand. You set yourself up against the whole human race with this. They will destroy you. Come back, and let everything be as it once was. Alaya laughed behind him. Like tame beasts? No. I've had enough of playing demure. I was born to be a queen, and I have waited long enough for it. Darling, I don't know why it makes you unhappy. We can take you in, give you a principality of your own, immortality. Then you can be with us forever, the one eternal royal family of the whole world. Things became clearer. He had been right to resist bringing them away from their own soil. Here, uprooted from history, they had begun to redefine themselves, not as the boyar lords of some little holding, but as Strigoi first. They were shedding their mortal identities as they had once shed their flesh, and the thing inside, the horrible, unfettered determination to feed and eat and live, no matter the cost, was beginning to show itself true. Frank and he followed his parents down to the Sultan's private apartments, through comforts the man would never need again, past servants whose eyes were blurred with someone else's thoughts. They came at last to a small white bathroom, lit with a lamp of silver-green glass. Next to a still pool lined with tiles like golden water lilies, there lay on the marble two things that looked as though they had been carved from oak, or mummified by hot sands. Radu could not quite unravel the shape of them at first. When he did, it took him even longer to believe it. The creatures lay face upright, sexless, shriveled things with wings. Each had a bowl beside them, empty now, only the staining remaining to show that it had been full of blood. Their mouths, flushed with the same stain, were the only part of them that looked as though it had ever been alive. Between them, as though they were its honour guard, lay a shrouded corpse. The folds of the material showed where it had swelled over one long day. It had been washed and perfumed with unguents. The smell of them overlaid the smell of decay, but could not entirely disguise it. As Radu looked, still not immune despite everything, to the creeping horror of mortality, the fear of rot and contagion, the central corpse twitched like a man falling in his sleep. Radu took a step back, Alaya passing him to go to the corpse's head and fold back the winding sheet from its face. It jerked again as its skin tightened. With a purging hiss and miasma of stench, the decomposition fluids voided onto the floor around it. Its eyes opened, milky as half-cooked eggs. Arcing out of the noisome pool of its own dead flesh, it let out a cry, half howl, half sob, as the still chest heaved again. All along the corridor behind Radu, every servant he had passed collapsed to their knees and pressed their foreheads into the ground as the new fledgling got its limbs together under it and crawled like a dog to Constantine's feet. Radu hated the Turks as much as the next man, but even he could hardly bear the shame of doing this to their king. There was no enemy so repugnant as to deserve this. Constantine placed a hand in benediction on the fledgling sultan's head. He smiled at it the way sometimes, just enough to make Radu yearn for it with a terrible thirst. He had smiled at his son. Radu clenched his fists, hurt at a level below reason, below language. This is my son now. Constantin drove the sting deeper. I was the father of the ruler of a little petty fiefdom in the middle of nowhere. Now I am the father of the Padishah Emperor of the Ottoman Empire. There was nothing in his expression but contempt, and even that was the contempt a man spared to a maggot, a distaste for its presence that admitted no kinship, no understanding, no care. They cannot have lied to me all this time, all my life, Radu told himself again. The comfort of the thought had worn thinner than gauze. Because they could, of course. His life was a mayfly life compared with theirs, and love was such a useful tool. They had had so much practice with all the generations before his. They could refine their technique to produce the greatest sense of obligation with the least effort. I have armies now. Constantin raised the dead Sultan up by his armpits. There was a pattering of fluid to the floor as the body finished voiding its decay. But the presence behind its eyes had grown stronger. I have the framework of a mighty empire and territories to be bled. I will replace the elite troops with my own fledglings and farm the humans like the cattle they are. My armies will go out and bring all the countries of the world under my rule, the first and the last and the only undead empire, and you want me to return home. He laughed, but Radu thought the sound only a death rattle, the amusement just as false as the love. What was it he had lived with all these years? He had told himself that it was human, or that it at least remembered what it was to be human. That he and it could still touch across the barrier of death and shame and guilt. Was that true at all? But you could still be our child. Alaya held out a hand to him, small and strong and desperately familiar. He remembered running to her as an infant, climbing on her knee and hugging her tight, cold arms around his back, and a cold and perfumed cheek settling softly on the top of his head. Mother. She came forward and took his hand, the touch seeming to divide him in two. He trusted her, deeper than blood. He knew she was false. She turned his wrist up to the light. It's for your own good, darling. It's only because we love you. And something in him still wanted to give her that, wanted to give in, wanted to comfort her distress and make her smile. The silver-green light washed like spring over the thin blue veins under his skin. Across the pool from him, the wings of the mummified angels quivered, their knuckled knobs skittering against the floor. Radu tugged his hand back, experimentally, but his mother's grip didn't give. She pulled him forward, and he went. This was his mother. Of course he went with her to where his father stood, with his own hand outstretched, ready to pull him toward the sallow, seeping thing that stood between them, its eyes eager and its lips opened on curved, translucent fangs. They were going to feed him to their new son, like cattle led to the slaughter. No. Constantin had not yet touched him. He pulled back on Alaya's grip with all his strength, shocking her, making her take a step forward and hiss. The dead Sultan hissed like a snake, and behind him the angels bent their arms and clawed at the floor, trying to rise. Then Frank's voice, breaking comically high with a hysteria, shouted something wordless, and all at once it was as if he stood in the centre of the sun. The tiles and the water reflected a brilliant light pouring from no source Radu could see. Everything was white and gold, blazing. The grip on his hand flinched away. 5 voices screamed with a sound like hell on earth. Squeezing his eyes shut, feeling the warm drip of tears from his chin, Radu threw himself backwards to freedom, collided with Frank. Frank stumbled, hit the wall, and as he righted himself the light went out. Frank was the source of it? I can see his magic second-hand. Radu picked him up, set him on his feet, looked behind to where 3 strigoi smouldered. His parents were only singed. The Sultan was on fire from the waist up. The angels were on hands and knees now, their eyeless sockets glaring. His parents bent to put out their protege. Radu seized Frank's arm and fled. Chapter 20, in which Osman, peace be upon him, goes outside for the first time. There came a knocking at the door. Zaid froze with his hand on the bolt. No light came through the windows of Ubayd's house any more. It was full dark. The city belonged to the foreign devils, and the boyar responsible had not returned. He didn't know what had. Hand on his charm, he called out, "Who's there? Is that Zaid? It's me!" He threw open all the chains and bolts, opened the door, grabbed her and pulled her inside. "Mother! It's not safe. What are you doing here? Have you left Auntie Jala all alone?" His mother set her back to the door as if the pressure of the night outside was trying to burst in. She adjusted her veil primly. "Jala is a grown woman. Besides, I saw your people going through the cemetery today, weeding out the demons. It isn't Jala I'm worried about." "We're fine," he said, as the foreign princess and her slave poked their heads out of the inner door and slumped to see their companions had not yet returned. "We're not fine," Ekaterina insisted. The others are not back. What have they been caught?" "Then we'll find out in the morning." Zaid ushered all the women back inside and shut the inner door. The whole household were gathered in the largest innermost room. Ubayd's wives and their slaves, his concubines and all their children. It was an oddly eerie experience, being surrounded by all those heavily draped and veiled women. He felt the world had turned inside out, and he was the immodest, exposed one. "What if they need help?" Mirella insisted. "I think that given that they brought this on all of us, if they need help they can find it for themselves," he said, and tried not to feel guilty or ungracious. But he couldn't get his mother to sit. He kept guiding her to cushions and pushing her down there, only to have her rise again as if on springs. "Zaid!" "Mother, whatever it is, it can wait until the morning. We're safe in here, and here we'll stay. The problem has already been reduced to what it was when they arrived. A few score of them left. They can be dealt with in safety tomorrow." But his mother was wriggly as a 2-year-old. "What about the Padishah?" She brought another roll of 10 charms out of her basket and flourished it in his face. He stepped back as if stabbed, because yes, as early as the end of the first night, his mother had given him a charm to give to the Padishah Emperor. He had decided Mahmud was not worth saving. He had given the only spare protection in the land to Haji Nabi instead. Now the Sultan was dead, and it was his fault. He had allowed the Lord of the Horizons, the Son of Glory, Father and Protector of all, to die, and he had done it through deliberate choice. He had just rather hoped she hadn't noticed. What about him? Zerina pushed him in the chest with the roll of paper. "There was a brother brought out of the caves this morning, bathed and groomed and prepared to be girded with the sword of Osman tomorrow. The criers say he is also called Osman, which is an auspicious sign in these dark times." "And so?" "We didn't make a charm for him. The demons killed the last Sultan. What if tonight they're going to kill his successor?" Oh, indeed. They could keep the empire paralysed if, every night, they bit off its head. How long would it function without a sultan? How long would law and justice and tradition prevail if the fountain from which it came was blocked? The princess and her boy looked at one another. The boy's wide, tanned face, bright and sharp, the princess's eyes steely. They had returned just as the birds began to sing for evening, blood-stained and weary, and with a light in their faces as of one who has done hard work, and thinks better of himself because of it. "We'll go," said the princess, Ekaterina. "These things killed my brother. If I meet with any of them in the night, it is they who should be afraid." Zayd would no more send out a woman and a eunuch to do a man's job than he would leave another sultan unprotected. "Neither of you speak Turkish. How will you get in the doors or explain what you brought when you have? I'll go." Ekaterina smiled. His reservations seemed silly all at once. What harm could come from giving such a charming woman the trifle that she desired? "We'll come with you. Our friends may need help. You might need it too, if all is chaos up there. Both of us have powers you don't have. Both of us have known of these creatures and their limitations all our lives. We are not to be dismissed." Zayd had forgotten. He had fallen back into thinking them nothing more than the foreign lord's household. But this might indeed make things easier. He flipped the bundle of charms open, drew his travelling pen from under his robe, and uncapped it. He was not a great artist, but the hastily sketched portrait of Haji Nabi looked very like the man, to his eyes. "Can you look like this?" The boy examined the paper closely, closed his eyes. If indeed he was a boy, who could tell if his shape was not fixed? "How tall?" "Up to here," Zayd indicated his own eye level, and watched with a mixture of admiration and disgust as the boy's body stretched and expanded to fit. "Colours for his clothes, eyes and hair?" "An emerald robe, a jade-green turban, black eyebrows and beard, eyes the colour of treacle, a little darker. Allah have mercy, you are the very man himself." Mirella, and was that a boy's name? He wasn't sure. Gave a wide, white grin. "Sugar and smoke-blackened teeth," Zayd corrected, taken aback to see such a roguish look on the dignified face. It made him wonder what the Mufti had been like in his youth, before he had the spiritual well-being of the entire empire emptied on his head. Could he ever have smiled with such abandon? "You'll still have to speak for me." Mirella examined his reflection in the faint shine of a black marble pillar. "But that's fine. I'm too important to make idle conversation anyway. Shall we?" "Mother, you'll stay here?" She took him by the shoulders and kissed him on both cheeks, the press of her lips indistinguishable beneath the heavy, greasy touch of her indigo-dyed veil. "I will. Go to victory or to paradise, my son." The solemn exhortation shook him a little, but he left her sitting, one of Ubayd's younger children scrambling into her lap. If he came home tomorrow, unscathed, he vowed she should have grandchildren. He would finally tell her yes to a wife, be the expense what it may. Perhaps it was that thought that let him smile as he drew back all the locks on the door and stepped out into the alien night. Or perhaps, with an enchantress and a shapeshifter as his companions, it was just that he felt that he was the hero in a story and things were bound to turn out well. It was a long way up to the palace from the harbour. They saw signs of improvement. Someone had opened up one of the refreshment stalls in the tea garden. Twice a brave traveller went past them at a near trot, head down, face turned away. People had noticed then the clearing of the graveyards, the burning of the infected dead, and had recovered some of their bravery, enough to go out at night if dire need pressed. But the guards at the souk sat in their little stone guardhouses and did not come out, and the guards at the covered market did the same, watching as Haji Nabi and his hangers-on strode up the street of armourers, turned into the street of perfumers, and disappeared from view, not coming out to challenge or to guide him. The first thing Zaid noticed next was the yellow dogs, streaming down past them as they huffed up the final approach to the palace. As the creatures loped past, their tall pricked ears alert, their golden Anubis eyes wary, they seemed to be silently telling him to run away. Topkapi was brilliant with torches. In the first court, cursing grooms and plunging white-eyed horses screamed at one another, the grooms trying to pull the horses physically from their stables, give their reins to the increasing army of Strigoi, who one by one were trickling into the courtyard, lining up like soldiers. There were palace cooks and black eunuchs, concubines and courtiers, all of them with the sagging, ashen look of the newly dead. A faint squishing sound accompanied them as they walked. Their eyes were white as marbles, and the smell of them was almost visible as a fog above the fountains. As Zaid watched, one of the hanged men dangling from the janissary tree pulled open the noose around his neck and stepped down to join them. He counted just under 100, all standing solemnly in lines, waiting for the squealing horses to be brought to them. But the horses were having none of it. Wild with terror, they dragged even the most spiked bit, pulled their grooms off their feet, and went streaming out of the gate, hauling the stable hands behind. Under cover of the general panic, Zaid and the women took the chance to slip past the gate and duck down one of the corridors that led around the back of the public buildings. If the true Nabi was in the palace, he would surely be in the rooms he used for offices. "Do they have no will of their own?" he whispered, puzzled as they left the creature's stoic indifference behind them. Despite the chaos around them, the company of Strigoi stood at rest, as if there wasn't a mind between them. Zaid had expected the slightest sound to give him away, as it almost had at the lodging house. But these things stood as if they were impaled, and gave few signs of being conscious. "They're too young," Mirella whispered back. "They're fragile things when they're new." He gave a twisted sort of sideways shrug. "Well, more fragile than they are when they're older. If they're only a day or two old, they're probably having enough trouble trying to form their new bodies before their old ones give out. Planning is for the sires, like... Oh." Into the chaos there sauntered the White Lord and his wife. Next to him, Zaid fought the terror and the blasphemy, the instinctive urge to kneel, to cry out in denial. Next to him walked Sultan Mahmud, with the same dazed, dead eyes as the soldiers, and the same flaccid, lifeless obedience. Mahmud had terrified Zaid in life, but that made no difference to the scour of white-hot fury that boiled up from within him, seeing the dead body of an honoured Padishah emperor made some foreigner's slave. He opened his mouth to shout defiance, and Ekaterina slid a palm over it, impressed. "Shh! It's the living we need to protect now. Come on." A moment's thought proved her wise. He nodded, and she dropped her hand. They watched together as Constantin dismissed the few horses that had not yet managed to bolt, and beckoned. Beyond the company of Strigoi, the palace's janissaries began to emerge from the quarters and form themselves into a blank-eyed square. Zaid didn't know whether to be proud of them for standing so undaunted, loyal to Mahmud beyond death, despite the sweat of terror that soaked their uniforms, or whether to be ashamed that they would take orders from abominations risen from the grave. Whichever it should be, he was at least grateful that the army was dragging its feet. The assembly was slow, the soldiers unwilling. The Strigoi remained detained in this place, easy to be avoided. Quietly as they could, he and the women slipped into the network of little courts behind the public squares. Shadows amid shadows, they came to Nabi's rooms unchallenged, stepped inside. It stank of hashish and oil of aloes, and it was utterly empty. Zaid gave a hiss of frustration. He is at his own house after all. The pile of cushions on the divan trembled. Embroidered peacocks and pomegranates stirred and slid aside, and Nabi's long, saffron-coloured arm came squirming out like a crooked snake. Haji! Zaid bowed, delighted that his friend and mentor was still alive. We remembered that we had not made charms for the Sultan, nor for the Valide Sultana, nor for the Sultan's sons and brothers. I've brought them now, and I pray it isn't. Give me one! Nabi snatched a magic square from his hand, wadded it small and folded it to his forehead, his eyes shutting and his laboured breathing slowly smoothing out as he relaxed. Oh, Allah is merciful, I thought. But I gave one to you before, my father. How do you come to be unprotected now? Nabi's eyes opened, sharp and stern. Because I gave mine to the Sultan's last remaining brother, Osman, he who will be Sultan himself if he survives to see tomorrow. Now I dare move in this place, we must find him and protect him. Mahmud will want to see him dead if he wishes to carry on ruling from the afterlife. Zaid welcomed the older man's wisdom, his direction. He was glad to surrender the responsibility of thought to Nabi. Where will Osman be? In his private apartments in the harem. Nabi sighed. Where, even in this time of blasphemy, neither you nor I may enter. Not too proud to admit that when someone else proved right, Zaid explained the problem to his companions. Mirella, back in the guise of a eunuch, and the princess, worthy by power, if not by beauty, of a place among the great ladies of the land herself. We can enter it, Ekaterina agreed. She drew her sword, and Mirella at her side gave a jaunty little wave. Take us there. This isn't quite what I thought. Mirella looked around the harem, while Ekaterina concentrated on charming the guard into allowing her to take her sword inside. It was more difficult than usual. The guard, a 6-foot-tall African, shaped like a fertility goddess, seemed more worried about the darkness behind him than overwhelmed by the radiance of her presence. She prevailed in the end, helped by the fact that Mirella now looked like a stately odalisque who belonged inside rather than outside the doors. But she didn't like his state of distractedness. Surely all the Strigoi were off doing whatever it was they intended to do with their little army. What was left in here that had an influence more powerful than hers? They stepped down into the marble floors, where only a few lamps glimmered on low tables. Small doors were shut with curtains, the occasional light flowing out from beneath them. Small chambers that could be separated from the main rooms, given notional thresholds over which a visitor would have to be invited if he was to stay. I thought it would be a cross between a prison and a brothel. Mirella's cheerful smile had gained a jumping tick of nerves on the left-hand side that sometimes made her look like she sneered. This is more like a living room. A living room can be a prison if you can't get out. Up and through another courtyard, and now they came to true doors again, doors of light wickerwork that shook beneath their inquiring hands but did not open, wedged or bolted inside. Wives' quarters? Mirella asked, ignorant and proud of it. Then she raised her voice and shouted, "Hey in there, is Osman with you?" The somnolent quiet of the darkness seemed to stir. Ekaterina jumped, her heart racing. The blood fluttering in her veins made all the distant lanterns seem to flicker. and she thought the air moved strangely against her skin. Shh! How else are we supposed to? From the end of the corridor, where painted and gilded double doors enclosed a much grander room, they came on all fours, oddly balanced and moving like bears, front legs shorter than the back. Ekaterina saw only darkness and wings at first, until they looked up and their faces were all teeth. "Shit!" she said, and they saw her, blind eyes turning to her as though they smelled her fear. The foremost gave an awkward, hunched leap and threw himself into the air, his skin wings creaking as they flapped, his legs dangling awkwardly, knocking over tables, smashing cups and silverware. 3/4 dead still, only a will in the hands and the wings and the teeth. But they were fast. A long hand caught her chin, twisted her head painfully, and threw her to the ground. She landed jarringly on the base of her spine, going numb from the tailbone down. With another bound, the creature settled on her chest, its impact knocking her elbows out from behind her, pushing her to the floor, with its mummified limbs atop her. Its head lowered. She turned her face away, and then something of heavy, thick glass hit it in the temple and shattered, raining shards on Ekaterina's skin. Mirella had thrown a sherbet jug at it, the scent of lemon incongruously clean amid the wreckage. The heads of both beasts swung round until all the attention was on Mirella. She squeaked when their eyeless gazes landed on her, and then transformed into the likeness of Constantin Vacarescu. Uncertainty slowed them both, opened the clawed fingers that tore into Ekaterina's shoulders. She took the chance to thrash and buck until she could get the angel off. When it hit the ground, rather than coming back at her, it crawled away, dragging itself on its belly over to Mirella. It gave an odd, plaintive groan, like a dog that wants petting, and then a second, more demanding whine. Ekaterina got her sword more firmly back in her grip, slipped past Mirella and the angels both, and hammered on the double doors. "Osman! If you're in there, it's not safe. You have to get away." Both angels were sniffing at the air again. To Ekaterina's nose, Mirella smelled so powerfully of jasmine she could detect nothing else. But the angels must have sniffed out that she was not the real Constantin at all. Their teeth lengthened. They spread their wings from wall to wall, cutting off the girl's escape. Mirella, weaponless, retreated until she was pressed against the locked doors, Ekaterina standing between her and the oncoming creatures. The tension snapped. Both angels hissed at the same time, their wings clapped. They drove themselves forward with their clawed arms outstretched, and the doors opened behind Mirella. Someone plucked her inside, hauled Ekaterina in by the collar, and shut the doors again behind her with a smack. Ekaterina accepted the beam someone held out to her, fumbled it into its wrought iron casings and the stone jambs on either side of the door, barring it. She laughed twice in harsh coughs before choking it off lest it become hysteria. The arm that had pulled them to safety proved to be attached to a young man with a hennaed beard and the worried, innocent eyes of a man raised entirely outside the world. "I'm Osman," he said, in heavily accented book Latin, as something heavy hit the door and brought flakes of paint down from the ceiling. "And I do not understand a word you're saying." "But I understand you." Ekaterina blessed her tutors and her lifetime study of learned books. Osman's too. Of course, even in the Ottoman Empire, every educated person could speak Latin. "And I tell you, we need to get you out of here. We need to take you somewhere the Strigoi don't know where to find you, or you won't live until tomorrow." Scratching noises came from outside the door, and then a boom as something heavy threw itself into the planks. The locking beam jumped and rattled in its supports, and Osman winced. I have been protecting myself through many, many years of palace infighting and my brother's madness. With Nabi's help I could have got through this too. But still, let us not sit debating survival, but depart this place and accomplish it. Ekaterina was grudgingly impressed by his calm and command, but she didn't have time to say so. The door shuddered and thumped against its hinges, and though the bar held, the wood itself creaked and bowed. Even as she hesitated, a desiccated hand crawled beneath the planks, curled around the bottom of the door, and pulled. The mortice joint snapped. The plank separated from its brothers, and a gap appeared in the door, through which the fingers of another hand came scrabbling. "These creatures don't seem to need an invitation," she said. "They're not Strigoi. They're something I haven't seen before, and they're coming through that door whether we want it or not. Is there another way out?" "Yes." Osman nodded at the wall, where a panel of coloured marble depicted a vase of orange and purple tulips, with sharp petals curved like a knife. "Through there. Hold them off a moment, I'll open it." With a rending rip and crack, the bottom of the outer doors splintered and was pulled away. Mirella squeaked with dismay, jumped backwards just as two long arms squirmed through the hole and caught at her ankle with yellowed nails. Ekaterina slashed down at the invading arms, opened terrible cuts that did no more than seep a little black blood. Her next blow chipped an arm bone, stopped them not at all. The hand twisted and tried to grasp her sword blade. She drew it back sharply in disgust and severed a couple of fingers. "Joints, then," she thought with satisfaction. "I can cut the joints." But Osman had the tulip panel open. Mirella gave Ekaterina a not at all apologetic smile and climbed in. Osman was coming away from the door, reaching out a hand as if to take her sword. "Now you," he said. "I will defend you. I have trained to wield a sword, and I have too." Fencing lessons every Friday. Twice a week, once Stefan was old enough to hold a blade. "I am here to rescue you, Your Highness. You have an empire to take back. You do not have the luxury of heroics." He looked abashed. Nodding, he dashed for the hole in the wall. The flowered panel was 2 feet tall and 1 foot wide. It took him a while to wriggle in, drop down into what must be a passage beneath. By that time a second pair of arms were grasping and hauling at the door, the hole in it big enough to admit a shoulder and then a head. Ekaterina hacked down, trying to sever the neck. But the angel twisted, caught the blow on its cheekbone. The skin of the face peeled open, showing the workings of tendons and the serpent-toothed jaw. It didn't stop grabbing at her, pulling at her feet. She jumped back, slewed round the great chest, and dropped it on the questing fingers, plugging the hole if only for a moment. With a great effort of will, she turned her back on it, writhed into the gap in the wall, leaned out and pulled the panel shut behind her, and then she too fell into the dim and dust of the passage. Osman caught her, so she didn't jar an ankle. She liked him for that, but wouldn't say so. "Which way?" Further down the passage, a floor drain brought a flicker of lamplight. It was all dust and rubble, uneven and cramped. Mortar rained down as people walked in the rooms overhead. "This way." Osman squeezed himself to the front, and then through a strange dog-legged corner which Ekaterina might have taken for an alcove. "I've been opening these passages since I was a boy. And a good thing too. When my brother's executioners came for me, this is where I hid. I suppose, now I am to be Sultan, I shall have to close them again, lest my own rivals use them to thwart me." Muffled through the stone came the groan and thunder of the double doors in the Sultan's chamber giving way, the angry hissing of the creatures that came in after and found the room empty. "Let's not count our chickens just yet," Ekaterina warned, imagining them sniffing around the walls. How long till they found the tunnels, broke through, and came down into the warren with them? "Just lead us out of the city, somewhere we can lose ourselves." "The Grand Mufti visited me to offer me this charm," Osman said, indicating the scroll bead of his pendant. He pulled himself up to a higher level. Perhaps it's possible to get out through his rooms. This way. Quiet for a while. Darkness closed in as they clambered through small spaces away from the light. Ekaterina found herself obsessed by listening. All their different ways of panting, the sounds of their feet. Was there something scratching behind, that faint, soft sound of flesh being rubbed off wing supports? The angels did not breathe, and she didn't know how they saw, eyeless as they were. Would they stumble in the dark? Would they make noise that could not be covered up by the chinks and rattle of stones under mortal feet, the breathing and the curses? She felt hot and squeezed by the passages, weighed down with dread, but she heard nothing. It wasn't until Osman had found a panel of lattice work, swung it open, and clambered out that she was seized by the ankle, tipped onto her face and pulled back into a hungry mouth. She shrieked like an owl. Plunging her sword straight back into the darkness, she felt it hit something chalky and pushed through. Teeth hit the ground with a patter as her sword blade sliced them, buried itself in soft palate, and stopped with a jar against the skull. The creature closed its mouth and bit down on the blade. It was more than she could do to draw the sword back out of the pressure of its jaw. The second angel began clambering over the first to get at her. Then hands reached into the passage from outside and drew her out by the shoulders. She turned to thank Osman and found it wasn't him at all. It was Zayd, with the Sheikh al-Islam, Haji Nabi, right behind him, beaming with relief. The angel still clung to her leg. It was drawn out with her, still biting the end of her sword. Zayd gave a choking laugh at the sight of it and brought his scimitar down on the nape of its neck. The blade slipped between two vertebrae, and with a wet sucking noise the whole head popped off. A moment later the body jerked and went limp, and Ekaterina was able to pull her foot and sword away. Behind it, the second angel turned as if to flee into the warren of passages. Ekaterina leaned in to grab it, to try to finish it off. Nabi turned aside to pick up the bow he had laid on his divan, Zayd and Osman looking startled, as if they had heard something unexpected. Ekaterina's blow did not go wild this time. Her aim was true. The point of her sword caught the retreating corpse just below the jaw and lodged in its throat. She waggled it, almost disappointed by how easily these creatures died compared to their less ferocious-looking kin. Another little jabbing stroke, and this neck too was severed. A violent echoing crash reverberated behind her as the doors to the council chamber broke open and rebounded from the walls. She turned at Mirella's warning scream to find 2 more angels had burst into the room, taking everyone by surprise. Nabi had been bending down to pick up his quiver when the first of them hurtled through the doors. It was on him in one bound before he could straighten up. Like a snake's mouth when it devours an antelope, its jaw stretched impossibly wide as it took him by the shoulders and engulfed his whole head in its maw. Ekaterina glanced at the other one. It was being kept at bay by Mirella with her dagger, as Zayd manoeuvred into position to decapitate it. Not needed there, she leapt at the monster that had Nabi in the great ring of its teeth. Seeing her coming, its jaw tightened, and the room was splashed suddenly with a curtain of warm crimson. Nabi jerked twice, then hung from its mouth, swaying and trembling. She didn't remember the blow that finished it off, just came to herself moments later with the angel decapitated at her feet, and Nabi's bow and arrows clutched to her chest like a baby, as if saving them would somehow make everything right again. Osman and Zayd prized the creature's mouth open, and it was obvious at once that Nabi was beyond help. Zayd turned away, covering his face with his hands. Ekaterina could not allow that. If one stopped running, reacting, even for a moment, one might never dare start again. They could not risk regret or sentiment, not until everything was done and safely achieved. Better give him something to do before he slowed enough for all the regrets and grief to catch up. Zaid, we don't know how many of these things there are. We need to get His Highness out of here at once. You know the way. Lead on. Even with 4 of them, it was not a hard thing to sneak out of the first court. The place was now all but filled to capacity with other humans. The 100 fledglings still stood impassive, impervious to time, their eyes incurious and their faces as if made from wax. Beneath them, all the space was filled with the beyliks of the Sultan's personal regiment. The dead Sultan himself was flanked by a pair of Solak archers. Behind that, an order of Sekban Janissaries stood with less patience than the undead, while their military band fiddled with the straps of their drums. The reek of terrified humanity was thick enough to conceal the fugitives, even if there had been a dozen more. But Ekaterina still felt shaky and thin with tension when the gates were passed and behind her. Istanbul's nighttime streets felt as blameless and welcoming as her father's hall by comparison to the haunted palace they had just left. It being the quickest way to Ubayd's customs house, they returned via the covered market. All of them were flagging now, their steps dragging. Ekaterina hung her head and allowed herself to think of a hot bath, a meal, a soft bed to sleep in. But then the mehter music started up behind her, the crash of big drums and cymbals, the eerie, unnerving drone of the Zuma. They were close enough to still hear the footsteps, all coming down in time and shaking the earth as though a giant was strolling up behind them. The army was coming. "In here!" Mirella threw back a curtain that closed a little perfume shop to the side of the road and darted inside. Zaid exchanged a glimpse with Ekaterina, but she had no better idea. Osman was looking around as though he could not work out what anything was. She wondered if he'd even seen the sky before in his life. Surely, before he was a threat and a potential spare heir, he had been allowed to be a boy. It didn't seem like it. His face was full of wonder as she hauled him inside the shop and drew the curtain closed again. Tiny jars of perfume stood on all the many shelves. Further in the back, an inner door opened into a storeroom filled with larger amphorae, sweating sweetness in their straw-packed storage. The night here was a cacophony of scents, so thick it made Ekaterina's cheeks feel as though they'd burst into flour. Not an entirely pleasant sensation, but a relief after all that blood. Here. Mirella passed out vials of oil to each of them. "The strigoi hunt by smell. Put this on and they won't know your food." She watched Ekaterina dab at her wrists with patchouli, grabbed the bottle and dumped its contents entire over her head. So Ekaterina was wiping sticky, slimy, nose-numbing scent out of her eyes when the army passed by. She didn't see the 2 dark forms following it, loping from shadow to shadow as they hunted the hunters. But Zaid did. He pointed them out to her once she could safely open her eyes. 2 strangely dressed shapes paused in a shop doorway to minimise the risk that someone in the army would look behind and see them as the last ranks turned the corner. When the final drummer passed the street of goldsmiths and disappeared around the bend in the road, Zaid darted out into the open market and came back with Radu and Frank in his train. Ekaterina would apologise to Stefan's shade for it later, but she found herself grinning, absurdly pleased to see them. "I knew you had not run away," she said, as Mirella dumped attar of roses over their heads. The perfume was especially necessary in their cases. They stank like a latrine, and their boots were caked in brown up to the calf. "What happened to you?" "What are they saying?" Osman demanded in Latin, for they had all lapsed into elation by instinct. Frank's grin echoed Ekaterina's own incredulous relief at being reunited. He switched languages with effortless ease. "It's not very glamorous, I'm afraid. We stayed out too late, and the Strigoi caught us. They planned to turn this into their own empire, using Mahmud as a puppet, and converting the Ottoman armies into an army of fledglings with which to conquer humanity and farm us like cattle. They wanted to offer Radu the chance to join them." "Why?" Osman put down the bottle he had been examining and looked sharply at Radu, who looked so terrible, so bruised and tired, Ekaterina almost felt sorry for him. Radu grimaced, paused for a long time, apparently to put the foreign words together in his head before he tried to pronounce them. Then he said carefully, "Who are you, and what business is it of yours?" "I am... Tomorrow I will be girded with the sword of Osman. I will be Osman the Fifth, Padishah Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, shadow of God on earth." Radu laughed. Ekaterina wondered how he would try to wriggle out of giving an honest answer to Osman's question. "My father asked me to join him because he knew I approved of killing Turks? That wouldn't go down well." Radu only rose and bowed. "I am Radu Vacarescu, son of the devil, your highness. It is my father who has done this in your land. He gave me the opportunity to approve of it and join him. I declined." A quick and bitter silence, and then Frank filled it with a self-depreciating grin. "Then we ran away and hid in a cesspit until they were gone. Does anyone know what they're up to now? We probably ought to stop it if we can." "How can we?" Ekaterina was sick of the stench of flowers. Her head hurt, and she wanted to go to bed while she let the Turks deal with their own crisis. "The only thing that works is the charms, and we can't make them fast enough." Radu looked even more savage than usual, scraped and discoloured, with droplets of rose oil bouncing on the ends of his flicked-up locks of two black hair. But his gesture was suitably tentative when he reached out to the bow and quiver she was still clutching tight. Unthinkingly, he fell back into his own language and hers. "May I?" She handed it over, but didn't fully understand his thought until he began to systematically remove the arrowheads and sharpen the points of the wooden shafts. "Oh, stakes! Tiny stakes that can be driven in from a distance. Wouldn't the points splinter?" She went into the back room and dug out a lamp, lighting it as she returned to the front. "The tips would be better if they were fire-hardened." He grinned at her, unexpectedly bright and fierce. She had to admit she rather liked it. "If my demons die, there is a future for us. And Lord, what wolf-like children we would have between us." But that was just presumption. Scowling at him, she wondered if her magic had finally gone to his head. One quiverful of arrows is hardly going to do it. Radu snorted, dismissed her in favour of his boy. "Frank, I know you still have problems with spontaneous magic, but you cast fine when there is a known spell you can follow, am I right?" Frank nodded, and looked as bitterly ashamed of himself as Ekaterina could have wished. She'd had such hopes of him. A genuine mage, full of power. It was such a disappointment to discover that something crippled him inside, prevented any of it coming out. "Then is there some way that your sun-like spell could be attached to a physical object, to something we could throw at them?" "Ooh! Ooh!" Morella waved a perfume bottle in the space between them. "Put it on the oil. Then when you throw the bottle and the glass breaks, the oil will come out and soak their bodies with sunlight. They won't be able to run away from it in time to save themselves. That's brilliant, can you?" I don't," Frank stuttered. "Theory's not my—" Ekaterina looked across the circle of lamplight to Zaid. and saw her own look of curiosity, possibility mirrored there. They were both of them the theoreticians that Frank was not. "I think I can." "Yes," Zaid agreed. "If you can give us half an hour, I think we can." Thanks for listening. That was Sons of Devils, read by Galadir. The music was Gifts of Stars by Lloyd Rogers.